Chapter 6, the skeletal system, bone tissue. So, we'll begin with just a brief overview and then some functions and then go into the structure of bone. Bone is an organ made up of several different tissues. These tissues are going to work together. So the tissues that will work together are bone, cartilage, dense connective tissue, epithelium, various blood-forming tissues, adipose tissue, and nervous tissue. So many of these are the tissues that we learned and studied about in Chapter 5, and they all come together to form bone. Each individual bone is an organ, and along with these bones in the cartilage, this will make up our skeletal system. The functions of the skeletal system will be to support our soft tissues and provide attachment sites for our muscles. And so therefore it provides our structural framework for the body, our support. As far as protection, many of our internal organs are covered by our bones or the bony coverings, and so this helps to protect them from physical damage. Our bones will assist our skeletal muscles in the movement of our body parts, as our skeletal muscles will be attached to the bones. And another function of our skeletal system is to help maintain mineral homeostasis. And our bones will help maintain mineral homeostasis because they actually store and release several minerals. As most of you know, we talk about calcium building strong bones. So calcium is definitely one of the minerals that is stored and can be released from the skeletal system. And phosphorus is the other mineral that primarily is going to be stored and released from the skeletal system. Hemopoiesis means blood cell formation or the creation of blood cells. And this actually occurs in the red bone marrow, which will be located in our bones. And then finally, as far as storage functionality, our bones provide storage of triglycerides, so a fatty-like composite. I tell students oftentimes that, unfortunately, sometimes I think of my food or outside things in the terms of science. And as you know, there are people who actually eat bone marrow. And so when they eat this bone marrow, they typically will describe the fat consistency that it has or the richness provided by the fat, kind of like the marbling on a ribeye steak from the fat, but they talk about it in this bone marrow with the amount of fat. And so that fat that is produced or that is in the bone marrow, that's actually because it's a storage site for triglycerides, which if you remember from general biology or nutrition, if you've taken that, triglycerides are fat. So it is a storage for there. And we'll talk about where in the bones this storage goes on, where in the bones the hemopoiesis goes on, and all those kind of things. So these are your basic functions. Our bones are going to have several parts, and when we talk about the bones, it's best that we go through and talk about a long bone because it will contain all of these parts. So I've listed the parts out for you here. On the next slide, I'll go to and I'll actually point and show as we talk about them. Now, you'll see this SES here on epiphyses. ES will be plural. If it is just epiphysis, IS, then that means it is singular. So I'll show you that when we talk about the bone, it does have epiphyses because it has a distal and a proximal end, or two of them, but epiphyses is plural, epiphysis is singular. All right, so here is our long bone. And the diaphysis of the long bone will be the shaft of the bone. So it is going to be the longer part that you would be able to grip around freely. And then the epiphyses here, I said a proximal one and a distal one. So at each end you have your epiphyses. And these epiphyses are the ends of the bones that will articulate with the bones next to them or adjacent to them. The metaphyses, you have 1 at each end as well, or one on either side of the diaphysis. This metaphyses, these are the areas between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. It's going to include an area that we call your epiphyseal plate. This epiphyseal plate or epiphyseal line is going to be the site of bone elongation in cartilage. Now, I would like to point out the difference here. This says epiphyseal line. This means that growing has ceased. When it is an epiphyseal plate, growing can still occur. So we'll talk about that again. But epiphyseal plate is an area where growth can occur. An epiphyseal line is what forms after growth has ended. So a child would have an epiphyseal plate, whereas an adult would have an epiphyseal line. And then we have our hyaline cartilage. Our hyaline cartilage, which is articular cartilage, is going to be at the end of the bone, and that's going to help reduce friction and absorb shock in the joints that we have that are freely movable. So here, the bone we're looking at is the humerus, and so we know that we can freely move from our shoulder joint as well as from our elbow joint, so we have this articular cartilage to help with shock and to reduce friction. And then the periosteum, so they are opening here this flap of bone. This periosteum is the outer covering. It's a connective tissue covering the surface of the bone. And it will contain osteogenic cells. Those are the cells that can actually promote bone growth in width. So the bone growing out and getting wider. This periosteum can also assist in fracture repair. It can help nourish the bone tissue. And it's where our ligaments and our tendons will actually attach to the bone here at the periosteum. Then within the diaphysis here, we actually have the marrow cavity. So it is nice and hollow, and it will contain that yellow marrow that we talked about for the storage of triglycerides. It can also contain some adipose tissue, so more fat deposits as well. And then finally, we have what we call the inosteum. You can see if you look closely here, they are peeling away the inside or the interior covering of our bone, and that's the inosteum. It will line the medullary cavity. So the inosteum is inside, the periosteum is around when we talk about different linings or tissues covering or lining the bone. Our bone, when we then look at it as far as our histology of bone goes, these slides are actually a little different in order, so we'll come back to those, but bone is going to be an osseous tissue that consists of widely separated cells surrounded by large amounts of our matrix. So remember when we talked about our tissue types, we said that we would have cells and then we would have the ground matrix to make these different tissues up. So bone has widely separated cells and large amounts of matrix. In the cells, we have four principal types. We have the osteoprogenitor or the osteogenic cells. So remember we just said those osteogenic cells were within our periosteum helping us to grow in width. But we have those osteogenic and osteoprogenitor cells. We have our osteoblast. When we were talking about cell types, we said that the blast cell was the builder cell. So here this cell is bone building. And it will promote bone deposition, or us actually building and laying the groundwork for this bone. Then our osteocytes, the sites were the mature cells or the maintenance cells. So these will actually maintain our bone tissue. And then finally, we have our osteoclast. Our osteoclast are derived from monocytes, a white blood cell type. And so these osteoclasts will serve to break down or do what we call resorb bone tissue. Resorb bone tissue is when we then break down the tissue and release the calcium and the minerals that were in the tissue, making it strong and hard. Now, this matrix that surrounds the bones, it's made up of inorganic salts and some calcium carbonate, collagen fibers, and we have this water as well. When we go through the process of depositing the collagen fibers and the crystallized mineral salts, that is called calcification, or we can refer to it as mineralization. And so this process of calcification can only occur in the presence of collagen fibers. So if we don't have any collagen fibers present in our extracellular matrix, we will not actually create bone. We will just have mineral deposits. So we need the collagen to be present with the mineral salts for us to actually go through our calcification process. Now, depending on the size and the distribution of the spaces between the hard components of the bone, we can then call our bone either compact or spongy. So you'll see here the compact bone, and here you see the spongy bone. And then we also have some of the portions of the bone or parts of the bone we named earlier. This is the proximal epiphyses. This here is an epiphyseal line. And then the metaphyses before we make our way down into the diaphysis, which we can see the medullary cavity in. And if you notice, this compact bone is around the outer region, and then the spongy bone will help to make up the epiphyses. Our compact bone will be good at providing protection and support, where our spongy bone, of course, is going to be more lightweight, and it does provide some tissue support as well. So the compact bone provides that protection, nice and dense. The spongy bone, not as dense, so it is lightweight. Our compact bone will then be arranged in units that we call Haversian systems or osteons. So you see here the osteon, this entire unit, or the Haversian system. So here's one osteon. Here is another entire osteon from here to here. And then this is a cut portion of an osteon, another cut portion of an osteon. And so all of these are together, and it will make up the outer part of the bone. Each osteon will contain a set of blood vessels, will also contain lymphatic vessels, nerves, and the osteocytes along with the calcified matrix. So it has its own little network of systems. Blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, nerves, osteocytes, and it is in the calcified matrix. Now, all of the osteons, if you notice, they're all arranged in the same direction here. So they're arranged in directions along the lines of stress that our bones will take. So as our bones change, these lines of stress, and so the orientation of these osteons can also change. Now the spongy bone, you'll see we're actually beginning to create it here, more towards the inside. So compact bone on the outside, the spongy bone on the inside. And so this spongy or cancellous bone, it doesn't have osteons. Instead, it contains what we call trabeculae. These trabeculae here will surround the space that has the red bone marrow in it, and so it's going to form the interiormost structure of mainly our short, flat, and irregular shaped bones, and then it also form the epiphyses of the long bones as we were demonstrating here in this picture. Now, this spongy bone tissue, it's going to be light, and it will provide these open spaces between the trabeculae for the red bone marrow to be there. And remember, we said when we talked about the functionality a couple of slides back, or at the beginning of the slides, we said the functionality of the red bone marrow was the site of hemopoiesis, or the site of creating our blood cells. With our bone here, because it is an organ, we can actually do a bone scan for a diagnostic procedure that can help us detect certain bone abnormalities or disorders in people. Now, as far as the blood and the nerve supply of bone go, our bone will be richly supplied with blood. As you notice, all of these many networks of arteries and veins. So the arterial supply is going to be made up of several vessels that will direct their blood to those areas of the bone. The periosteal artery that we have, it's going to enter in through what we call Volkmann's canal. It is accompanied with a nerve, and there is also a periosteal vein. So these periosteal arteries, nerves, and the veins, they pass through Volkmann's canal, and then they supply the outer compact bone regions. We also have a nutrient artery and vein. This nutrient artery and vein passes through the nutrient canal, also known as the nutrient foramen. So a foramen is always going to be a hole. So this nutrient artery and vein will pass through the nutrient foramen, and it will send branches into our Haversian canals to provide the nutrients for the osteocytes. So this is now supplying our compact bone as well. And then that nutrient artery will continue into the medullae and supply blood for the marrow here, and also the osteocells via our epiphyseal artery and vein. And then we also have a set of metaphyseal arteries and veins supplying that region of the bone as well. So now remember, arteries carry blood to and the tissue, and veins will carry blood away from the tissue. Nerves will typically follow the vessels into the bone tissue and also into the periosteum, as you see here, and they can sense the damage that may be occurring in the bone, as well as transmit pain messages to you. So if you fracture or break your bone and it is very painful, that is because the bones are supplied with nerves.